All right, hi. Welcome to my live stream. I'm Mark Graben, and I am the host of a number of podcasts. Among other things, I'm the host of a podcast called Lean Blog Interviews. I'm a host of a podcast called My Favorite Mistake. And today I've got a guest here, a friend of mine, Ryan McCormack. We've met, how many years ago? I should welcome you, but we'll keep this casual. We met maybe 10 years ago?
I'd say 10-ish, yeah.
Maybe a touch more. So we crossed paths when I was involved with the Lean Enterprise Institute and an organization now called Catalysis. I had a chance to come visit Ryan's organization. So Ryan, how about if you want to fill in some of the details here about where you live and where you were working at the time and what you're doing now in terms of some introductions.
Sure. So my name's Ryan. I live in sunny Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Mark, you and I first met when I worked at St. Boniface Hospital. They were engaged in a fairly significant lean transformation starting in about 2007. And of course, our paths crossed through all sorts of learning events and Gemba visits across North America. Currently, I work for Canadian Pacific Railway based out of here in Winnipeg. We're undergoing a lot of transformation as well as we learn to be the best operating railroad in North America.
And so your career has kind of taken a path of, I don't know, like three phases, like pre-healthcare, then your time in healthcare, and now you've been doing other things. What was helpful for you? What was that transition like pre-healthcare coming into healthcare with your job at St. Boniface?
Wow, yeah, pre-healthcare, the idea of using industrial engineering techniques or this type of continuous improvement technique in healthcare was still fairly unheard of at the time. So the challenge early on was just convincing people that these methods have merit and can actually be helpful in reducing harm for patients and also improving flow and financials. So the early part of that was really just on that demonstration and convincing. Of course, now it's fairly well established that it can be part of an approach to transform healthcare and improve value. Post-healthcare, it's been a bit of adjustment to get back to private industry with a little more results focus than public healthcare in Canada had. So I've enjoyed that transition back as well, and I've been able to apply a lot of what I learned in healthcare, which is probably the most complex system you can work in, into my roles post healthcare.
Yeah. And there are opportunities that we've both had to help bring ideas from one industry to another. Then there's the question of bringing ideas across borders. I've been part of groups to come up to Winnipeg, there to St. Boniface years ago. You were part of groups to come down to the US. The Canadian healthcare system in the different provinces is, of course, very different in a lot of ways from the high-level structure of the US health system. But what comes to mind when you think in terms of things that can actually be learned when it comes to healthcare delivery, commonalities or lessons that can be shared?
Yeah, I mean, that was a common question I would get is, well, that works well in public healthcare, but what about private? And truth be told, having visited so many different locations throughout Canada and the US, the problems that the healthcare providers and patients and facilities encountered were all the same. It like the who pays side rarely figured in the main causes of what was preventing the delivery of the highest quality care. Was your usual suspects applied absolutely everywhere. So and that bore out really quickly. I personally thought it would be a bigger difference. I remember the first time we went to Appleton, I was like, well, yeah, but it's the US, so it won't be the same. But once we talked to the first nurse and first doctor about what was frustrating them, I realized the problems are absolutely the same.
Those day-to-day challenges, when it really gets into the nitty-gritty of how care is organized and how care is delivered, tends to be very similar. There may be slightly different systemic root causes to an issue like emergency room waiting times. in the US, it might be people who don't have insurance and don't have access to care, so they go to the emergency room. In Canada, there might be other drivers leading people to come to the ER when it's questionable. Should this be emergency care or not?
Yeah, and of course, probably the biggest contributor to systemic emergency backlog in Canada is downstream, which is the lack of capacity in acute medical wards primarily, which isn't always the case in the US.
Yeah. So, and speaking of different places, and please do add into the chat where you're from. I see people have been doing that already. We've got people here from South Africa, Chile, Ghana, Iran. So
wow,
really cool to have a global audience to say hello to and share a cup of coffee with. Well, the one thing I wanted to talk about today, and one thing I've been really appreciative of Ryan for, is something he puts out every other Friday. He calls it the Operational Excellence Mixtape. And if you are ever short on something to read, or you're looking for a new podcast to listen to, Ryan does such a good job of curating things that would be interesting on topics of operational excellence, or even things that might be kind of on the periphery of operational excellence when it comes to leadership and psychology and change management. So Ryan puts that out as an email, which you can sign up for. Or Ryan's been kind enough to allow me to post all of the mixtape going back a couple of years on my blog, leanblog.org. So if you do a search for Lean Blog Mixtape, you'll find Ryan's most recent one, and you'll find the history if you want to go into that. But I wanted to ask you, Ryan, what was the origin for putting together the mixtape, and maybe even explain for people what it is. We had somebody once who was looking for the music to listen to, and that's not, that's literally what a mixtape used to be. But tell us a little bit about this collection you do and how it got started.
Yeah, so when I started in healthcare, part of that whole convincing process that some of these ideas are worth experimenting with included the predisposition to healthcare professionals to look for the literature first. So I'd be like, hey, why don't we try this approach, or why don't we run an experiment on this particular process? And one of the defensiveness or even the questions I would get from providers is, what does the literature say? So that was starting to frustrate me a bit, and I thought, well, okay, what does the literature say? So what I started to do was procure different articles, at the time mostly from like New England Journal of Medicine, that related to improvement. And then I started sending those out to a mailing list at the hospital every couple of weeks as here's what the literature says, as a way for us to discuss what it could mean for us at St. Boniface Hospital, but also as a way to kind of convince people, hey, why don't we try this? This is a legitimate approach. Look at other places are learning. And then from there, I had more people from the hospital start asking me, hey, I heard you send out these links. Could I be included as well? And then it just kind of spiraled from there, and it became something I started offering up publicly maybe 6 years ago. So I do, now people subscribe to it. Obviously you share it on your website, and it's kind of expanded away from just healthcare. It started off just as healthcare related links, and now I tend to include anything that I think is interesting relative to creating value, driving improvement, and coaching and developing self or others.
Yeah, so we had somebody asking in the comments how to find it. Again, you can go to leanblog.org, do this link / (S = mixtape, or you can just Google Lean Blog Ryan Mixtape, and you can get it through the blog, or there are links in all of those posts for how you can sign up to get it directly from Ryan via email. We've got people here also from, Missouri, Nigeria, Florida, Wisconsin, South Carolina. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, it's right. My blog, back in 2005, it's funny, I was doing something very similar before I started the blog. I would send articles out to a list of friends, some of them from work, some of them from grad school. And then, at some point I said, well, let me put it on a blog. I'll let people pull for that information. Sometimes people appreciate having the information pushed out them. So to me, this isn't an academic discussion of which is best push versus pull. People have options.
Absolutely.
I have a question just triggered by something you said when it comes to journal articles. One thing I think is fascinating, I think especially in healthcare, there's a reliance on looking at the literature when that comes to clinical innovations or clinical decision making, and you can do these controlled double-blind studies on medications or therapeutic treatments. I think a lot of that makes sense. When it comes to management and culture, I think it's a lot more difficult to do those types of studies. You can look for evidence, anecdotal and measurable, that lean methods work in healthcare. And people will say, well, show me the journal article that proves this work, when the prevailing existing management system was not chosen based off of.
Absolutely. There's no evidence for what we're currently doing. So why not try even or take a leap of faith? But that argument doesn't compel too many people in healthcare, in my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people do get anchored in the status quo. It must be the status quo for a reason. And I think those of us who do work with lean and other methodologies tend to think, well, everything can be better. We can create improvements to the existing system or create a new system. But back to the mixtapes. So, again, I encourage people to check those out. Ryan shares links to articles online, books. We always know what he's reading or what he's about to read and what he's listening to. Is there a recent favorite book or one that you've read that you might want to share a little bit about?
Sure. I'd say some of my more recent favorites. There's one book by Roger Martin. It's called, here, I have it right here, When More Is Not Better.
Huh.
Oh, if you can see it right here.
Because he writes a lot about corporate strategy, is that
correct? Yeah, so he's a professor at the University of Toronto here in Canada. He writes a lot about corporate strategy. I found this book particularly interesting. It's a bit of a modern take on some principles that we're all familiar with from Deming, I would say. He walks through some fairly well-publicized examples of where seeking efficiency for its own sake can create a host of problems rather than solve them. It can lead to monopolistic situations. It can lead to sub-optimization and short-termism. Whereas, of course, students of improvement often know that long-term thinking is essential principle, and thinking of the whole system is a lot more sustainable than thinking of improving a part. So it was good. He walks through, for example, the Wells Fargo example that many of us are familiar with, where even sub-optimizing against a metric caused systemic damage to the customers and to the brand of Wells Fargo that continue to endure today. So he offers up some different ways of thinking from a business executive point of view, from an academic point of view, and even into political point of views. I'm not really a political guy, but he offers up some ideas of how to make long-term improvements and gains for everybody in a political sense. So that's one book I highly recommend. It's quite readable and not too long.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the Wells Fargo case, and this is something I've blogged about, where the CEO decided 8 is great, and that every customer should have 8 accounts. It's hard to think of 8 different products you could have: a mortgage, a checking account, a savings account, a car loan. I guess you could have investment vehicles. But that led to, as you described it, a very systemic problem where frontline bank employees and managers were under pressure to either pressure customers into signing up for accounts they didn't need, or even doing so on behalf of the customer when it wasn't authorized. And so you talked about the harm to the customers, the harm to Wells Fargo's reputation. It actually also harmed a lot of people's careers, because individuals were fired for what I would really, I would die on this hill, that this was a systemic problem. It was happening all across the bank. And it's a systemic problem, I think, driven by the pressure. There's another book out there called The Tyranny of Metrics. This might fall in that category.
Very good book.
And it was driven by organizational policy And if the bank wanted to say, well, we had thousands of unethical employees, that's a different systemic problem. And I don't believe it was thousands of unethical employees. So some of these people literally can't work in banking or finance again if they were fired for cause, which is, you know, a different level of damaging.
Yeah, and the basic thesis of when more is not better is if we've gotten pretty good over 100 years of treating business as a mechanical machine that we can optimize by pulling levers. But that doesn't always lend itself to sustainable improvement in the more complex environments we have today. Now, that said, that was an argument in healthcare I used to get a lot as to why not to apply these principles. It would be like, well, we're a complex adaptive system, therefore these methods don't work. But of course, thinking systemically, respecting individuals, and learning through experimentation are completely consistent with these ideas of how to create noise and change within a complex adaptive framework as well.
Yeah. There was a second book you were about to mention, is that right?
Yeah, I could mention 100, but here's another one I like that I brought with me. It's called How Innovation Works by Matt Ridley. Innovation is the flavor these days. I find many big organizations are engaging in innovation labs, pursuing innovation as the new methodology to help propel them and help transform. There's some great historical walks through innovation over history, whether it's the steam engine to the computer. And Matt Ridley does a great job of sharing what the underlying principles are that are common with innovation throughout human history. And they're things, again, very familiar to lean thinkers. Things like collaboration. Most innovation over history was actually done by what he refers to in the book as unlettered people. So this is another reason to engage widely in your organizations to drive improvement. People need to be free to experiment and learn from trial and error. That's an essential ingredient to innovation throughout human history, as well as gradual incrementalism. That's part of the challenge why big organizations engaging in innovation strategies may struggle with that short-termism. You want that big step change. You want to go all in on that one change. But history shows us that sustainable innovation and breakthrough innovations come from long-term gradual incrementalism.
Does the book touch on the idea, can you turn innovation into a process?
Yeah, I mean, it does, but the spoiler alert, the process is the scientific method. So it wasn't a great insight to me personally reading the book, but that's essentially what one can arrive through there. Interesting too that over history, innovation tends to be a competition, and quite often the degree to which simultaneous innovation for the same breakthrough or the same problem happens over history is remarkable. But that just goes to show more reason to be transparent and more reason to collaborate across the globe. And today there's very few barriers in doing that.
And when they say unlettered, you mean people without college degrees and the letters after their names that we see in healthcare, at least?
Yeah, read the book and you find out many of the innovations that made human life better came from people just tinkering, just regular people trying things out, tinkering.
Yeah. And like you were saying, that points to the need to engage everyone in the organization in continuous improvement and tap into everybody's creativity.
Don't make innovation a department that has a license or monopoly on ideas in your organization. Engage widely, engage deeply, and engage frequently in unleashing freedom for people to test out their ideas without fear of failure, and with the support to move forward.
Yeah. There was a comment in the chat here from Tom, who works in healthcare, Tom Bouthillet, and he says, there isn't much evidence for many of our medical treatments either. I know a couple of years ago, I heard Dr. Brent James, who's pretty legendary in the healthcare quality improvement circles. And at the time, maybe a decade ago, he said maybe 1/3 of medicine is driven by like really well-known evidence-based best practices. Like it's typically the most common kind of illnesses. You said a lot of things in children's medicine, but then a lot of healthcare. And I've faced this as a patient a couple of times over the last 15 years, getting wildly different opinions from two different physicians or two different surgeons about what the right path forward was. And in their own mind, they were each correct, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's another book I've been reading too, is Noise by Daniel Kahneman. It's a good reminder of this topic about variation, which is obviously near and dear to lean thinkers as well. But it just reinforces the point you just made: is variation is way more rampant than we think. And you know what? Humans are lousy at judgment. And the bad news is machines that we're building now are only slightly better. Unfortunately, the book, for those of you who've read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which was one of the better books I've ever read, I had high expectations. I found Noise to be good, but ironically, I found it to be a bit noisy as well.
Delving in the topics that kind of distracted from the main point.
Yeah, I would move around a lot. It had a lot of different discussion on how to calculate error throughout the book. I felt that it could have been delivered more clearly and in about half the number of pages.
Yeah, that's true with a lot of books, and I hope I'm not guilty of that with any of mine. So Ryan loves sharing books, and then he's also a podcast listener. Is there a podcast episode or a podcast series that comes to mind recently for you? Something you enjoyed?
Sure. I'm a big fan of The Knowledge Project by Shane Parrish, who has a website called Farnham Street, which is quite popular. He brings on a lot of heavy-hitting thinkers that share ideas. Recently, the last one I recall listening to, he had Danny Meyer, who's the founder of Shake Shack, on. The lessons he shared on customer service are universal and were just inspiring. I find Shane Parrish's his writings and his podcast really challenge traditional ways of thinking. Those of you who follow the Mixtape know I'm also a big fan of Coaching for Leaders with Dave Stachowiak. They're good too because they're shorter, like 20 to 30 minutes. He brings on great coaches. I can relate to almost every episode. It's at one part of my career, and it's listenable in like my commute. So that's enjoyable. Of course, Lean Blog podcast, classic, that I continue to listen to. Hey, Mark, I just noticed the other day that you published just a brief list of those who've been guests on your podcast that are no longer with us. And of course, one of my personal mentors, Dr. Michel Tétrault, you mentioned and reshared his audio clip. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, you obviously got to work with him much more closely than I did. I probably had, 4 or 5 different, encounters with him visiting St. Boniface Hospital. I will never forget how he was part of a group that went and visited an airbag manufacturer in Utah called Autoleave. And so here he was crossing borders, crossing industries, looking for lessons about improving safety and lean management. And we all miss him a lot. I know he was very principled, to me, a very principled and earnest and inspiring leader, the little bit I got to talk with him.
Absolutely. Another podcast I'd like to recommend everybody that I listened to recently was the Work Life with Adam Grant. He recently had a podcast centered on speaking up at work. And I think he did a great job of dissecting the very prevalent and popular concept around psychological safety. He shared some interviews with some folks from Boeing as like what contributed to the 737 MAX tragedies. He brings on some military guests as well to talk about how to cultivate psychological safety and remind us that it's not about being nice to everybody. That's a common thing I get when I bring up this subject is psychological safety is not just being nice and placating people at all. And I think Admiral McRaven on this particular podcast does a great job of reminding us how to achieve psychological safety without it becoming an exercise in softness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in that episode, Amy Edmondson from Harvard was, I think, one of the experts that was she? I haven't listened to it, so I saw that. I think I saw the notes. Did he? He had interviews interspersed with different people in that episode. I should go and listen to it.
Yeah, Amy Edmondson was on it. Again, another great book, The Fearless Organization. I recommend without reservation to anyone on the line right now. Is about psychological safety and what are the factors that contribute to creating a culture where people aren't afraid to speak up at work. And the stakes are really high. That's what we're talking about. In healthcare, people can die.
Yeah.
We saw in the aircraft industry, people can die. So the stakes are very high. This is a very important topic, and a lot can be learned from these podcasts and books.
Yeah. And I was really fortunate to have a chance to interview Professor Amy Edmondson in my Lean blog interviews podcast series, talking about her book and psychological safety. So maybe the last thing before we wrap up, in interviews recently, I've come up with this question of, all right, tell me the best thing and the worst thing about blank. What's the best thing about doing operational excellence work like you do, regardless of the industry?
For me personally, the best thing is teaching and developing others with these principles. I was fortunate to have strong mentors throughout my career, and whenever I'm able to give back in any job or any situation, if I look back at my proudest accomplishments, it's those I was able to help along their journey. I'd say the worst thing is, I mean, it's kind of the flip side of one of the better things. One of the better things also is that, you get to work on all sorts of interesting problems. So you're never bored. But I got to tell you, once in a while, it'd be nice to be bored and just do some, I had a director that I used to work for who'd say, you know what, sometimes you just need to dig a ditch. And I think what he meant was sometimes you need to get into a routine in order to liberate some of your thinking to come up with your most novel ideas. And that sounds weird, but sometimes it'd be nice to get into more of a routine. And I find in operational excellence, you have to adapt and move on to problems very quickly. So that's one of the, I shouldn't say it's a worse thing, but it's one downside.
Yeah. And I'll invite people in the chat, maybe if you do work in this field of operational excellence or Lean Six Sigma, however you frame it, if you want to share something that's a best thing or a worst thing about doing that type of work, it would be interesting to see. Best thing, worst thing about living in Winnipeg? I'm throwing this out here as a curveball. Best thing about living in Winnipeg?
The sense of community. Winnipeg's well known for its small town feel in a big city. I'd say that's the best thing. And if you're in Winnipeg, you're halfway to everywhere,
Yeah.
Kind of.
Right in the middle of the country, pretty much, right?
But that's also the worst thing, is you're halfway to everywhere. So to get anywhere, you have to travel as well. I know people hate the winters here. Like, that's a big sticking point of Winnipeg. Everyone thinks that's hilarious, but I've lived in Canada my whole life. I love the winter. That doesn't bother me, but it does. Yeah, we're being isolated. Sometimes Winnipeg's a bit behind the trends as well, and sometimes perhaps Winnipeg suffers from a bit of an inferiority complex as a result.
Compared to
it's unfounded. It's unfounded.
Unfounded, yeah. And you've got your hockey team back, which I'm sure helps in terms of civic pride.
Absolutely, go Jets.
Final thing here, and again, I want to give exposure and a plug to a project of Ryan's. Every other Friday, he publishes what he calls his Operational Excellence Mixtape. It's an email that he sends out. It's also available on my blog, leanblog.org. So if you search, again, Lean Blog for Mixtape, you can read those. You can subscribe through the blog, or you can subscribe if you want to get them directly from Ryan via email. every 2 weeks. So kind of final thing here, best thing about putting together the Operational Excellence mixtapes to you?
Well, it forces me to stay current. It keeps me motivated to keep learning and reading and listening and learning from others, and to be able to share that as well. So that's the best thing.
Is there a worse thing? It might not be horrible, but what's the worst thing about?
Well, again, this isn't a worse thing, but since I've been publishing the mixtape, it's been about 9 years total. The amount of paywall has increased every year over year. So the amount of free and shareable material has gone down a lot.
All right, well, there we go. I think this ends up being a flexible question. Best thing, worst thing. I mean, worst doesn't mean horrible. It just means, I guess, all things considered. So like, the worst pizza is still pizza. It's still generally pretty good. Right? Well, Ryan, thank you a lot for doing the discussion here today. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And I know the conversation will continue in the chat with those who have been watching this as a recording. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in, joining us around the world. Ryan McCormack, it's been good to talk to you. I'm glad we could share it today through the live stream.
Thanks. Pleasure as always. For those listening, subscribe to the mixtape or hit me up on LinkedIn too, and let's chat improvement.
All right. Thanks again.
Bye now.